I'm Julian Schwarzenbach, and obviously my co-presenter today is Tim. Normally we'd be in the same room, so we'd actually be able to nod at each other, kick each other under the table if we're going astray, but obviously we can't do that today, so we'll work as best we can as a double act. As Mark said, the book that we produced, Managing Data Quality, a Practical Guide, was published by BCS Books, coming out on Star Wars Day, May the 4th. And it's been a longish journey for Tim and I. We've both worked on this together, and what we're going to be doing today is giving you some highlights from the book, giving a little bit more of the reason behind why we created the book. And also hopefully encouraging you to purchase it, not least of which there's a discount code that you'll be getting at the end of the presentation. So we'll go through that. So the agenda we're covering today is thinking a little bit about some of the organisational context of data quality, the challenge enterprise data, ISO 8000 Part 61, and then implementing data quality management, and then we're going to end with Q&A as per normal. If you can ask questions using the question panel on GoToWebinar, Mark will then ask them on your behalf. But in terms of the book itself, it is basically broken down into three key areas, which correspond to the second, third, and fourth bullet points on the slide today. So in other words, the challenge of enterprise data, ISO 8000, and implementing data quality management. So what we're going to do now is just set a little bit of context and then start going through that. So one of the challenges first is just understanding, well, what context are we dealing with? Now, this slide is one that I've used for a few years now, and it actually is heavily in need of an update based on the way things are going, and I'll explain. So this is a graph of GDP growth within the UK economy. You may remember that economists for quite a while have been concerned about how productivity has been flatlining since 2008, 2009. Now, clearly 2020 is kind of dropped off a cliff, but we'll park that one for now. But one of the reasons for that that's becoming increasingly evident to me is the fact that for many organizations, the way they are doing data, in inverted commas, is actually a significant brake on the efficiency of the organization. So the number of times that people are spending time putting software in and it not quite working to plan, problems with data migration, the anticipated benefits aren't there, functionality doesn't meet things. So the impacts of poor data exploitation and poor data quality management on the organization actually are quite significant. So hand over to Tim for the next contextual slide.
Yes, good morning everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation. So this is one of my favourite, I guess arguably might be a slightly inappropriate word, but it's a very compelling example for me, and I never hesitate to use it, even when people will already know it. But Mars Climate Orbiter in September 1999 was just about to enter the atmosphere of the planet Mars and begin the main phase of its scientific mission, when the spaceship disappeared from the monitoring systems back at NASA headquarters. And it very quickly became apparent that the spacecraft had suffered some sort of failure, and it took them only a relatively short period, a couple of weeks, to identify that the problem had literally been one value in one data file, and that was exchanged between two different groups of engineers, and one of them had misread the software specification, and so the number had been supplied as if it was in imperial units, whereas the specification itself had stated that the number needed to be in metric units. So that, of course, illustrates very precisely just how powerful data can be in the world that we now live in. But again, the interesting thing about that story, and why that then leads into some of the content of the book itself, is because they recognized that it wasn't just about one piece of data. It was about the organizational context in which that data file had been created and was being used. And as soon as one takes that perspective, one begins to open up and understand that it is not just about the data, but it is also about the people, the processes and the tools as well.
Okay, so what we'll now cover is a little bit more about the challenge of enterprise data. And so the process of creating the book was interesting because for some parts, it's in the first and last section, a lot of this was work that I've been doing, training material I've been using for a number of years that was in effect has been brought to life, updated, polished further, and has become part of the book. But also particularly on the Part 60, ISO 8000 Part 61 section, some of that has now been refined and developed and has actually come back out to influence some of the training that we're doing. So a lot of the thinking has been on the go for a little while and has been tested in a number of environments. So just apologies if you may have heard some of these slides or some of the things I'm going to say before, but this is all part of the journey we had of getting into the book. So the first one is that I use quite regularly is getting people to think about for any particular business activity is what makes up that activity. And in most cases, you have an activity, in theory, it supports the strategy of the organization. There's some governance in place to make sure that things work as intended. But the four key elements of the strategy of the business activity are firstly the process, the thing that needs to be done. And typically data will be an input to an output from that process and may well be created or modified by that process. Software and systems and technology is used to automate the process. And then finally, you have the people who are the actors in all this who make it all happen. For many organizations, particularly if they're engaging in change projects, a lot of the focus of people and management is on the software, because typically the software has a name, it has a large price ticket with it in some cases, and it is an easy thing to focus on to say we're implementing version X of product Y. But what some people forget to think about is the fact that the data in the new software will be the data that you currently have that's just been migrated across. In many cases, the process of data migration actually is presents quite a high risk of corruption of the data, of making the data quality problems that you've got worse rather than better. So it could be that the process of implementing the software actually creates greater problems for your data. And for many organizations as well, in that kind of scenario, there is a belief that by implementing best of breed software, magically all your data quality problems are going to go away, and that isn't the case. Typically, the data that exists in the organization is data that will have been there for some time, and it will live through into the new software system and actually get migrated into the replacement for that system at some point in the future. So the thing that lasts the longest in this diagram is actually the data and not the software. And so what we try and encourage people to think about is making sure that there is actually a balance in thinking and a balance of priorities between software and data. Another thing that we touch on in the book and explain a little bit more is about what I term the data triangle. So thinking about data exploitation and the fact there are three key things that you need to have in place to make sure your data exploitation works. And a little bit like a tripod, the tripod won't stand up if these three aren't present. So first off, you need to actually have some subject matter expertise. You need to have somebody involved in the exploitation activities who both understands the business problem, but also understands the data and how it represents that problem, who understands implicitly what is being done by the organization. You also need some analytic tools, and you need somebody who knows how to process and use those tools to actually deliver the output. For example, it's putting those two together. If you take the world's best developer in a particular bit of a software tool or an analytic tool, and they have no experience of the domain or the business problems that you're trying to solve, the value they can deliver is actually quite limited. And so the two need to go together to make sure they work. And then the final part of the triangle is having data of known quality. So we're not suggesting that you need perfect data, because in fact, getting perfect data is an unrealistic goal for most organizations. But actually what you need to do is you need to understand the quality of your data. If you understand the quality, if you understand that what you've got may be only 80% of the data you're expecting, and of the data that you've got, there might be 10% that was migrated in from another system in the past and was corrupted in migration. If you know that when you're exploiting the data, then you can exploit it far better. Another thing to think about is considering data as a raw material for things that you're doing. So another analogy we've used here is if you're making furniture or making a product, if you think of your data as a little bit like steel or plastic or something that is newly manufactured, it comes with a conformance certificate, your challenge there is potentially thinking about how efficiently can we utilize that material to create something. However, if you think about a carpenter, a craftsman who's making maybe a piece of furniture using seasoned wood, so some of that wood may have knots in it. There might be a little bit of warping in some cases, or there might be some areas that have started to rot slightly. And the skill of the craftsman is looking at accepting and understanding those imperfections and trying to work out how best to utilize the wood to make a piece of furniture, for example. So it may well be that there's a piece of wood that is, the grain isn't as attractive, so maybe that's used for the back of a cabinet rather than being used for the front. And we're suggesting that data actually needs to be treated similar to wood as a raw material, that you need to think about what are the imperfections and how do we best make use of what we've got whilst recognizing and understanding those imperfections. Something else that is worth thinking about is maybe thinking about how your organization processes data. So if you were to ask somebody to visualize, if you were to visualize the way your organization does data as a machine, what might that machine look like? Perhaps if you're using enterprise grade software, it's a bit like an excavator in a quarry where there is a large piece of plant, it's expensive, it's powerful, it does the job really well, it shifts a lot of rock. Or perhaps if your software isn't being implemented particularly effectively, maybe the interfaces aren't working quite as well as you would hope, and some of the functionality wasn't delivered, and you've got some data migration issues, plus those inevitable Excel spreadsheets to bridge gaps in functionality, then the machine that is your way of exploiting data is perhaps a little bit more like this Heath Robinson variant of the same thing. It still excavates rock, but it's nowhere near as efficient, as effective, or coherent as the piece of plant on the left. Unfortunately, some organizations, if they've just spent a large amount of money on implementing enterprise-grade software, the exec team may think that they've got the machine on the left, but in reality, if they pull the plug towards the end and not all the functionality was delivered or implemented correctly, the reality might be that you're actually somewhere nearer the machine on the right. So understanding those limitations within your organization is quite key. It's also worth thinking through that data has particular life cycles, and if you're dealing with structured data, you go through a number of different stages, and each of those stages is a chance for the data quality to either be improved or degraded. Similarly with documents, the way they go through a review, approve, publish, and update and retire cycle, each of those can actually lead to changes in the way the data quality is understood. So we go through in the book, we actually spend quite a bit more time exploring these and helping you to understand how you can work better to actually improve the quality of the data. When we're talking about quality, it's worth mentioning that there are 6 key data quality attributes that we've referred to in the book. And in fact, this list came from some work that I was involved with that DAMA led a number of years ago now. A white paper was produced looking at data quality attributes. But the reason behind this is, if you use an analogy of the weather, if somebody says the weather is bad, you need to actually be a little bit more specific to understand what they mean. So if you're a farmer, good weather might be a mix of sunshine and showers. If you're a holiday maker, then you want sun but no showers. If you're a sailor, then you might want wind but not too much wind. So to describe weather and describe whether it's good or bad, you need to have an understanding of that. Similarly with data, there needs to be a recognition of what you mean when you're describing somebody as poor quality data. And so what we've done is we've gone through and provided some examples here about the different attributes of data and how they can be described. So first off, and the most important one probably is accuracy. So is there agreement between the data that you've got and the entity that it represents? And typically accuracy can only be checked by either somebody visiting something that is represented by the data, or at least dealing with a surrogate for that. And when you're thinking about inventory of lots of things, accuracy needs to go both ways. It needs to make sure that every data item that you've got has a physical entity that it represents that exists, and that each physical entity has a data entry associated with it. Completeness is making sure that not only have you got all the entities recorded, but for each of them, all the attributes that you're interested in are also correctly repopulated. Completeness and a number of these data quality attributes are things that can be assessed with either data profiling tools or software, but accuracy is the key one that can't. Consistency is the ability to correctly link data across different data sets. So if you've got an individual in the HR system, in your training system, and in your permits to work system, is it the same identifier? Can you follow that person through the organization? Thinking about timeliness, how up to date is your data? If people are making changes to the changes in the field, or they're dealing with customers, how quickly and how correctly are the updates being applied to the system? Uniqueness, have you got a single data entry representing each single entity rather than multiple entries? And then finally, validity. Does your data conform to all the rules that you've got defining both the syntax and the structure of the data? If you've got invalid data, you can clean some of that data in bulk. But one of the challenges you've got, again, going back to the accuracy one, is if you've got data that is complete, consistent, valid, and plausible, it could still be wrong. And so you need to be just think about that. Next thing to cover, and this is something that those of you who've heard me speak before may be familiar with, we've got a concept that we developed a number of years ago called the data zoo, which looks at the generic behaviors that people exhibit towards data. And the concepts within the data zoo have been refined and updated and are sort of built within the book, because how people behave, how people treat data is really, really important in terms of the success of your data-related initiatives. And the different behaviours we've got here, some just from the names, people normally get an idea of what they might represent. So the people like the squirrel and the data anarchist and the job's worth, many organisations have a number of these, and they can be a challenge for the organisation. What you hope for is that most people are useful, that you also have an evangelist who is somebody who's sort of making the case for change, who can actually see a vision for, if as an organisation we can exploit our data better, look at how much more efficient and profitable we'll be. But also you need the pod, the prophet of doom, somebody who says, well, actually, if we don't improve what we're doing, we're going to go out of business, or we're going to get taken over by a competitor, or the regulator's going to fine us. So both the evangelist and the prophet of doom create a pull and push motivator to change how, to inspire people to change how they approach data. But it's also worth reflecting, we'll come back to this a little bit later in this presentation, is that these are behaviours, they're not personality traits. They're influenced by the way the organisation is set up and how other people behave within the organisation. And so being aware of what drives behaviours is really, really important. And we expand on that in the book to give people a little bit more context in terms of why people may behave in certain ways and how to encourage better behaviours. So I'll now hand over to Tim, who's going to explain a bit more about the ISO 8000 approach. So Tim, over to you.
Thank you, Julian. So Julian there has explained the context that I'm sure all of us recognise from many different aspects of our own day-to-day working lives. And the standard itself is something that I've been involved with now since 2006, leading the working group that has developed the standard, and it is very much clearly designed as a solution to the sorts of challenges that Julian has spoken about. So if we go to the next slide. Yes, no, maybe. Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
Multitasking.
Yeah, just one will do. Number 16 would be good. So the standard itself, it is titled overall as data quality. It is, however, a multi-part standard, which is not particularly unusual in ISO, and it certainly has given us the ability to treat this in a very modular way. So we published our first part back in 2008, dealing with a very specific challenge around the exchange of master data. but we've subsequently gone on to reach a total of 17 parts published, and that gives us a far broader capability to address other aspects. We go as far as looking at some of the very specific issues that concern what we call PDQS, product data quality shape, which is where some of the very detailed mathematical aspects of 3D computer-aided design actually then has an impact on what happens when your car gets manufactured and delivered to you as a physical product with all of its beautiful geometry that was originally just data in a computer. So a broad set of parts, and we are still on that journey. So we still have another parts that are actually under development. So if we go to the next slide, please. The key point, though, and Julian hinted at this in some of the things that he said, but when we think about ISO 8000 and we think about data quality, we need to understand the fundamental theory of quality that has served as the foundation for the revolution of manufacturing driven by the Japanese, but of course whom took ideas from American researchers in this area, so people like Deming, and the core definition that sits in ISO 9000 is that quality is the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics of a product fulfills requirements. And therefore in ISO 8000 all we have done is taken that definition and it replaced your general whatever product it is and made it specifically about data. And this means that the core point that we have is that it's all about the requirements, and that's then what is shown by this this diagram itself, and that captures that essence that until we have understood and identified our requirements, then we will just be chasing quality as some sort of abstract concept of perfection. And as Julian says, that is just not realistic from an economic point of view and from the point of view of delivering value. This week I've found really stimulating the previous presentations that we've had, and we've heard various concepts that all play into the nature of this diagram. We've heard talk about data governance, which is basically the blue box at the bottom of this diagram, and the need for us to have a systematic approach to monitoring and controlling. We then have talked about the thrust of this week's presentations about delivering value with data. That's all about the top blue box there, where ultimately data is about being the foundation for our decision making. And I was really pleased with our colleague from the Bank of England on Monday, the very first presentation, when I asked a question about data ownership, and he came back and he said, actually, really, probably it's more important, you get more to the point if you understand that it's about owning the decisions that are taken, and those decisions are the source of the requirements that we then need to fulfill. As you can probably tell, I could carry on talking about this diagram for several hours before I might eventually run out of steam. Clearly, we don't have time for that today. But the point is that already in this diagram, we have captured the essence of the plan, do, check, act cycle. But if we go to the next slide, this then is very specifically the part 61, ISO 8000 part 61, which is then our process reference model. And you can see with the blue arrows from the top left there, we're going from planning to control to assurance to improvement. That is the quality version of plan, do, check, act. And part 61 takes all of those, it gives us some detail and lays that out as an international standard. But that then leads us to the next slide, where we can ask ourselves a fundamental question. If we've got that standard published, what role is there for a book to sit alongside the standard? Well, the point is then that the plan, do, check, act cycle itself is not actually a realistic implementation approach. And one of the ways I often try to get people engaged with the idea of quality is to pretty much go back to Julian's example of the craftsperson working, the artisan working with a, to prepare some sort of product. And the example I use there is the blacksmith. So a successful blacksmith will be one who will take a horse in to the forge and will fit some horseshoes, and the owner will know on the basis of the reputation of that blacksmith that they will walk away with a horse that is now going to be able to ride comfortably because of the horseshoes that have been fitted. But that is not an industrial scale process. That is not a way of delivering, whether it's the Mars Climate Orbiter, whether it's Crossrail that we've heard about this week, and so on. Those sorts of large scale complex activities need to be done in a systematically managed way, but there is a journey that we need to go along to go from that craftsperson's view all the way through to a fully mature organization where we have a culture of continual improvement. And then building on top of that, we also need to recognize, in terms of where we are with data, there are no greenfield sites. We know that we have been embracing and consuming computer technology now for several decades. But of course, we're also in the midst of a transformation built on the back of that. And so there is a constant stimulation of new technologies and new ways of deploying information technology to deliver business value. If we look at the mechanics then of the Part 61, the process reference model itself is built up with each process described with a purpose, with outcomes and activities. But there isn't any detail on tools, for instance, and there isn't also a description in context, illustrations with examples and so on to really help the reader understand how the, if you like, the sort of the raw, the very academic almost, or certainly very sterile of the standard actually applies to real life. I think the only thing that on reflection, having sort of pressed the button for the final time, if you like, on the book and sat back and breathed a huge sigh of relief, I do now recognize that perhaps there's a certain lack of cultural neutrality in one or two of the examples that we've used. But I guess for the moment, for the immediate audience, let's say that might well be appropriate. It might not always work so well in an international environment, perhaps. Next slide, please, Julian. So if we go back to the process reference model, and as I say, we look at that, we know there's a cycle, so there's always a question mark about where do I start that. Again, our own cultural norm would be to start top left-hand corner, and conceptually, generally we would say, yes, we're going to plan, and then we're going to do, and then yes, let's make sure we check and react. So there is a sense from this, the way the standard is written, from the way the cycle works, that one would start with the top left-hand corner. But if we go then to the next slide, the fundamental point that we then describe in the book is that there is actually a more realistic way of thinking about that journey. I've taken the top level words, if you like, from that previous slide and shown how they, with data processing right as the kernel of this model, starting there, if you have got a fantastic piece of analytics software, an algorithm that is, predicting that the way to double your sales in the next month is by making this change to what you're doing, you have an absolute fundamental capability that enables you to exploit information. But from an enterprise point of view, we want to build out from that really clever software and put that into an enterprise context with the other items that are on this diagram. which means if we click one more time, Julian, and then my voice will probably just last before it goes. A schoolboy error, not having a glass of water to hand when you're sitting in your study. But the point then is that the journey we describe is presented as a maturity model. And again, I was pleased to hear some references earlier in the week to maturity models. But the one thing that I think was sort of slightly missing in that description was to understand that, yes, there are plenty of consultants out there that will sell you a maturity model, and they might also encourage you to go and hug a few trees at the same time by having some nice fluffy words and help you along this journey. But the book itself lays out that actually there are technical characteristics at each of these levels of maturity that are represented by the specific activities that you are doing. And I almost feel that sometimes organizations don't like to, on perhaps a sort of more traditional type of maturity scale, don't like to blow their own trumpet, because I think they feel that they might expose themselves to ridicule, or it's almost, and also perhaps they're slightly self-effacing about it. Whereas what we've got here with this model, we can begin to objectively identify the activities, the functions that we have in place. And if we are delivering that function appropriately, then it does indicate that we are at one of the more mature levels, and hence that helps us to understand the journey. And that's me finished, I think, Julian, and it's handing back to you.
Right, thank you, Tim. Yes, so the final section of the book is really about how to give them guidance about how to implement data quality management in your organization. So typically most organizations, there is a huge amount of inertia preventing change, or it may well be that there are people who feel they're empowered to go and do things, but they're maybe not doing them in the most coordinated way. And so what the book does is now provide quite a few contextual views and some thoughts about what you need to consider if you're going to implement data quality management in the organization. So the first one to consider is the idea about what a data-enabled organization might look like. So whilst data, processes, software and people are sort of some of the pillars that make the organization work, and you've got a number of different departments and functions within an organization, data quality management is actually very similar to quality management and health and safety, where it's an underpinning function for the organization. And so therefore, a data-enabled version of your organization probably isn't going to look much different to the organization at the moment, but there will be more of a focus on the data quality management aspects that you're working on. And if there's that recognition, you're trying to get away from maybe the 1950s view of quality management in the car industry, where you're trying to inspect out defects, of trying to get the current sort of car industry view and the current quality thinking, where you're actually trying to build quality in from the start, and it's a quality-driven process all the way. Thinking about the overall approach to how you're actually going to do data quality management, there's a number of things that we cover in the book, and these are some factors for you to think about. Things like making sure you have senior level sponsorship. There's no point having a number of people who are very keen and enthusiastic about improving data if there isn't that high level drive and high level support to make sure things happen. You need to understand what's the organizational context, what's already going on within the organization, what are the synergies between different activities that are already ongoing that you might be able to exploit to actually help deliver improved approaches to data quality management. And you need to think through about how you're going to implement things. And this goes to Frederick's session yesterday about whether you actually go for the purist view of trying to come up with the perfect data policies and strategies and then launch them on the business, or you take the more organic, pragmatic view. And that's certainly the view that I tend to take, is that delivers value more quickly. But in some circumstances, having the more purist view actually may be more relevant. You need to think about the footprint, about where you're going to implement your approach. Are you going to start in one geographic area, one process, rather than trying to do the whole organization at once? How are you dealing with change? How are you dealing with challenge? What about the business case for making the change? We're going to come on to business case a little bit more in a second. but also recognizing that improving the approaches to data quality management might actually help de-risk some existing projects. If you've got a project that is going to rely on a large amount of data migration activity, then it would make sense to also make sure you're doing some work around improving and understanding your data quality as part of that project. But most importantly, it's actually just start implementing, communicate, let everybody know what you're trying to do, and then keep iterating and refining. So it's an ongoing change process. And the key message to get across is that data governance is not a project. It actually should be business as usual. It should start now. It should run through any particular business projects that are coming up and run through into business as usual on the other side, so to speak. Why might you do it? So what are the benefits of improving data quality? So I think there is a risk within the data quality world that we get perceived as purists who are worried about all the ones and zeros don't line up correctly. And in fact, the benefits of improving your data quality are financial. And something I've used, the quotation I've adapted from a 1980s quality management guru, Philip Crosby, who had the view that quality is free. I've adapted that, and so and we build on this in the book a little bit, in the view that data quality is free. It's not a gift, but it's free. What costs money are all the unquality things, all the actions that involve not getting data quality right the first time, and all the actions to correct these data quality issues. So if you think about your organization, if there are a lot of people doing, if you like, spreadsheet jockeys, they've got lots of Excel spreadsheets, they're spending a lot of time each week trying to rationalize data across these different spreadsheets, that's an inefficiency. That is going to be affecting the profitability and efficiency of the organization. It may also be affecting service quality if you're making incorrect decisions. So the reason, the benefits of improving data quality is not just about the ones and zeros, it is primarily about finance. And then getting on to the idea about business cases, and this again, something we touch on in the book. So if you think about the somebody doing maybe a PhD research project, they might be doing some experiments, there might be biology or physics or something, but there'll be a certain amount of uncertainty. And typically in that kind of context, people will be presenting results with a certain range. So we think the outcome is 15 plus or minus 8%, or there'll be some level of variance there. But if you think about a business context, how many business cases have you seen coming through where the cost is quoted as a number, the benefit is a number, and magically it fits within the payback period? So in this case, the cost is 280,000, benefits 120,000 a year, then your payback might be 2.3 years. So you might have presented with that business case, think, yeah, actually we'll approve that project. It's one that's worth proceeding with. But if you've maybe got somebody who's actually a little bit more enlightened, and they've maybe got a recognition that the cost is, there's some uncertainties around the cost, there are some uncertainties around the benefits, then it may well be that you're quoting a range of costs, a range of benefits, which gives you a range of different payback scenarios, which may well still mean that you've got a project that you view as beneficial, so you're going to approve that project. The numbers here, this midpoint of each of those ranges is exactly the same as project A at the top, but it's just reflecting the different sensitivities there based on the data quality. If we now expand that a little bit further and think about a slightly wider variance based on quality, you might find that your payback period is actually now, there's a significant variance between having a payback of 1.5 years, which sounds really, really good, or potentially 4 years. And if your organization's payback threshold is 3 years, then that project wouldn't fly, wouldn't gain approval. So in such a circumstance, a more enlightened approach might be to approve a limited amount of funds, let's say 20, 30, 40,000, to do some more analysis, to maybe do a proof of concept, do a pilot project, to try and actually get the costs and the benefits firmed up a little bit more to make a decision about whether the whole project is worth proceeding with or not. And that's a way of actually reducing the risk of the organization. We'll also talk in the book, again, going back to the data zoo and people's behaviors, trying to make it clear about the fact that behaviors are actually driven by beliefs. So if you want to change how people behave, you need to change their beliefs. A driving analogy is if somebody as a driver thinks they're a perfectly safe driver to drive at any speed on any road, and that speed cameras are there just to make some get some more revenue for the government from drivers who just happen to be unlucky, they will tend to drive a certain way. If that driver's belief is actually that inappropriate speed is a safety issue, and the speed cameras are there just to give a double check to make sure people aren't driving too fast, then your behaviours, the way you drive, will drive significantly differently than if you think that you're perfectly safe and the government is just trying to get money out of drivers. So some of the things that we cover in the book is looking at some of the desired data beliefs. So if you can change how people believe about data, then you can actually start to change their behaviour. So getting people to recognise that data is valuable, that good data quality improves efficiency and profitability, that poor data quality can be improved, and everyone has a role to play in improving that quality. A key one that actually comes up in many, many different organisations is that a task or a job isn't complete until all the required data has been provided. Also making sure that people recognise that if they're on the front line, if they're dealing with a customer in a call centre, or if they're somebody visiting a property or visiting an asset, they're currently that organisation's expert on that entity, and therefore they know if the data is wrong or not. Also trying to get people to realise that there is no silver bullet to improve data quality management. It actually will take time, possibly significant time. And if people understand that, then they can actually start to have a very different understanding and relationship to data. And so that's just giving you a very quick whistle-stop tour, both in terms of the structure of the book, and also has given some insights that have come from within the book. There's obviously a heck of a lot more within the book itself. The book is available from both Amazon and other good retailers, but also primarily from the BCS shop, which the URL is there on the screen. And because this is in effect the launch event for the book, we were hoping to, when we originally planned this, it was going to be a physical launch event with cake and all sorts, but actually we're having to go for a virtual event at the moment. But as part of that launch, there's actually a discount code there, which will actually give you 30% off the cost of the book in either paper or electronic form from the BCS shop. So that's a little bit of a bonus for those who've stuck with the webinar so far. So that's, I think, has got to the end of that. I don't know if Tim's got anything to add, but I think we'll hand it over to yourselves for questions.
No, answering questions would be good.
Great, because we have some questions come in, and feel free to send in more if you have them. First question from Frederick Varmans. It says, there is often a long chain of processes between the person creating the data record and the consumer of elements of that data record. Do you have any thoughts on how to encourage data inputters to enter the records accurately and completely for the wider benefit beyond their own?
Yes, I'll dip in on this one if that's all right, Tim. Couple of thoughts really. One is I think people need to, the more you can make people aware of the impact of the data that they're entering, then the more likely they are to improve the quality of what they do. And I think there's two sides to it. So one is trying to get the checks on the quality of new data to be as close to the point of entry as possible. So using an analogy of, if you've got teenage children who are in a habit of leaving dirty clothing all around the house for their parents to pick up and wash, then if you keep doing that, then the learned behavior of the teenagers is, well, I just dump clothes anywhere and mum or dad will pick it up and wash it. If on the other hand, you challenge people and challenge the teenager each time they do it and say, go and put it in the washing machine, go and put it in the laundry basket, they start to learn that for a quiet life, they might just as well get it done right first time. And it's very similar with data. If you can make sure that people are you're reviewing what they're doing as soon as you can after the point of data entry, and going back to people and challenging them if the data was wrong, then there may be a case where they might actually be able to remember what they did yesterday, so they might be able to put the correct data in there, and they start to know that actually, if I want a quiet life, if I don't want to stand out from my peers, I actually might as well just put this in correctly. And so I think that is a very good way of trying to encourage people to get it right first time. I think also, I talk about in both the presentations and the book about the fact that you can have a culture of non-compliance. So if you have people who have got used to the fact that they feel empowered to take shortcuts, they feel empowered to deviate from defined processes, then they're not going to do what you want with your data if they're used to sort of deviating from things elsewhere. So for example, if they fill in their timesheet very coarsely, they don't put any detail in there, and they may be being creative with their expenses forms, they're potentially the people you need to have the most time focused on, of trying to say, well, actually, if they're maybe fiddling, maybe not fiddling, but being a bit creative with their expenses, they potentially are also the people who are going to be causing me some problems with my data. So those are some of the people to think about. So I say is get the checking as close as you can up front to the point of data entry or the point that the data has been edited, and also look out for those areas where non-compliant behaviour might be a bit more endemic.
Okay, great, thank you, Julian. So next question is from Alexandra Rogacheva. She asks, would it be beneficial to present the business case, not just in terms of benefits, but also in terms of missed opportunities or even threats?
Yeah, if I step in on that one, absolutely. And one of the fundamental questions that any organization needs to ask itself is, can we uncover in one step what the true cost of data quality is? And in our experience, we've never found an organization that has been able to do that as a first pass. One of the examples that comes to my mind when I think about that is something that was very successful in Network Rail, and there it happened to involve the implementation of ISO 8000, which is one of the reasons why it means a lot to me. But what was really impressive about the way that the project was delivered was their ability to identify how to get the senior level engagement and commitment to the project. And what was necessary, or what they did in their case, was to consider the deployment on the basis of a bow ties model for risk. And the important thing about that is that on the right hand side of that model, it is all about understanding the things that your data is enabling, and therefore, yes, it puts a big emphasis on the opportunities that exist in order to extract the value from the data, alongside the other things in terms of where the origins, if you like, of what the data issues are, and working your way back on the left hand side of the model to go and understand what the root cause is. So it is very much aligned. Again, we've heard that in other presentations so far this week, understanding that it is an end-to-end chain along which the value is actually delivered.
Okay, great, thank you very much. Next question is from John Rallison, who asks, what do you feel the impacts of data security and governance are on data quality?
I think what it should do is actually make the organization far more data engaged, data enabled. If people treat data as just an annoying irritant and they just rather get on with doing whatever the day job is, then that doesn't encourage any improved approaches to data within the organization. However, if people know that there's suitable governance in place and that there's suitable senior level interest in what is being done around data, then that will both encourage people to provide better data, to use the data more appropriately, but also to work in a more collaborative way to improve how data is being stored and exploited by the organization. And I think also that on the back of that, that leads into the security questions. So if you have a better understanding of what data the organization has, where it is stored, and in particular, you're able to try and reduce the number of rogue Excel spreadsheets that might be littering the organization, then that makes managing the security of your data far more practicable. If you've got lots of uncontrolled spreadsheets dotted around and people who are behaving in, going back to what I mentioned earlier about non-compliant behavior, so if you've got people who are non-compliant, then they may also be non-compliant from a security perspective. So yes, improving data quality management, improved data governance actually does help support data security.
Okay, and then we have one last question here from Sakti Norton, who asks, legacy data sets bog us down but have huge potential for current exploitation. How do we deal with the data or metadata quality of these known unknowns effectively? Does the book go into this?
We touch on this, and I think a lot is down to understanding what you do, firstly understanding your data to a greater degree. So it may involve having to do some level of audit of your data quality, trying to make sure the level of audit is statistically significant, particularly if you're doing some accuracy checks of the data. And that will then help you understand what's going on. But also within the model, and what we touch on in the book, is about doing root cause analysis. So it's looking to see what are the underlying traits that might have led to a particular data quality problem. And if you've identified some of those, you can then start to identify how that might impact the data set as a whole. A number of years ago, I was involved in working in a large utility, and there was a large database we were working with where surveyors have been sent out to validate the data. One of the surveyors had actually misinterpreted the instructions about how the data should be recorded. And it was really interesting because it was a little bit like a fingerprint across the database. So you could spot where this one surveyor had been, because they had been incredibly consistent in how they had encoded the data, consistently sort of wrong to the overall definition. But because they've been consistent, it meant that you could actually interpret what they'd done far more easily and make sure that the appropriate insights were made on the data. Don't know if you want to add anything, Tim?
Yeah, so just picking up on that, I mean, it's interesting. You sort of referred to the instructions, and again that adds into, for me, one of the important elements that comes into this is the requirements. So again, we can't talk about the quality in an abstract sense. We need to understand what our requirements are, and I'm not always convinced that we have the discipline to consider those requirements before we get into the exciting cut and thrust of actually opening the package, if you like, and finding out what can the data do for us. And it can be a boring process to some extent at the beginning. So it sounds to me like those instructions were done in a way which again takes us back to Mars Climate Orbiter, where effectively it was perhaps an instruction that was written for a human being to read and then act upon. So how many of those requirements can we actually embed into computer processable data requirements, and then allow testing to take place at the computer level, noting, of course, as Julian again said in the introduction, that there are also pragmatic considerations, and it takes us back to the conversation that we had again earlier in the week on verification and validation. The verification, the combination of a data specification plus the data set, can verify whether we've got a match. That's not the same thing as taking that data back out into the wild, if you like, giving it to our end users and seeing whether the decisions that they make are actually valid, and that's where the validation word comes from.
I think another thing that's worth adding to that is something that may not be immediately apparent to some people, is the fact that the activity to develop your data standards and the activity of creating your data quality criteria are actually two related activities. And so we do expand on that in the book, but I'll cover it here as well, is the fact that if you've identified, for example, that if you're interested in furniture, and that length is an attribute that you're interested in your data definitions, you need to define, well, what are we measuring? Is it the longest horizontal dimension? So if that's the case of length, that's fine. If you're also defining that the length should be recorded in millimeters, then that allows you then to start creating some quality rules to firstly identify that it's a numeric value. So if there's any text in there, it makes it an invalid field because somebody might have put inches in by mistake. But also if you put some validation in, if it's a piece of furniture like an office desk, if the value, the number is less than 500, then it may be that somebody's entered the data in meters rather than millimeters. If it's greater than, let's say, 2,500, then it may well be that somebody's put in a wrong value or that something else has gone wrong. So that process of thinking about both the data definitions and the quality criteria, the two actually go very closely hand in hand, and it's worth thinking about the two at the same time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Julian. And thank you, Tim. We do have some more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation, enlivened as always by some very interesting and pertinent questions at the end. Please tune in to the rest of our webinar series. If there's anything you missed on this, it's available for on catch up. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.